Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's community conversation, sponsored by ASI and the Division of Equity, Inclusion, and Compliance. My name is Claudia Catoda, and I serve as the university's Chief Diversity Officer and Special Assistant to the President. I first want to thank ASI and our students for the recommendation on today's topic. Before we get started, I would like to welcome Vanessa Chica-Itza, our ASI President, to say a few words. Vanessa.
Yes, hello. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth edition of the CSUB Community Conversation. My name is Vanessa Chica-Itza, and I'm your ASI President. I would like to begin by thanking everyone who is in attendance today. I want students to know that the important topics being discussed today were all recommended by our students. This conversation is especially important because in order to move forward and address the issues that we still have today, we need to continue to learn and teach ourselves and future generations about the past in an honest way. If you would like a particular topic to be discussed in a future community conversation, please let me know. I will include my contact information in the chat below. For all of our students, I would also like to remind you that ASI continues to be an essential service. This is important to remember as we enter the fall semester. Our offices are currently open. However, we recommend that you communicate with us via email. Please never hesitate to contact me. And again, my info will be in the chat below. As always, I look forward to listening to our speakers today, and I appreciate you all for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Today we'll be exploring race and racism in the U.S. The topic of the panel is Why the Past Matters, How the History of Slavery Impacts Us Today. To discuss today's topic, we are joined by three historians. First is Dr. Alicia Rodriquez, is a professor of history and the director of interdisciplinary studies at CSUB. Dr. Rodriquez earned her PhD in history from UC Santa Barbara and also earned her BA from CSUB. Dr. Rodriguez's research interests include 19th century America, America South, and race relations. In 2017, Dr. Rodriguez published an article on the history of the Ku Klux Klan in Kern County. In 2012, she participated in a summer National Endowment for the Humanities Institute at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Center on African American Struggles for Freedom and Civil Rights. Next is Dr. Kiran Garcha, Assistant Professor of History, who recently joined our History Department at CSUB. Dr. Garcha earned her PhD from UC Santa Barbara. Her research interests include African American history, 1960s radical movements, U.S. labor and gender history, and the history of children in social movements. Her dissertation, Bringing the Vanguard Home, The Role of Children, Home, and Family in the Black Panther Party, explores how children were imaged and mobilized in the Black Panthers' vision for social economic change. Our third speaker is Dr. Gregory Mixon, who joins us from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and is an associate professor and graduate coordinator in the History Department. He has been a faculty member in the Department of History since 1999, where he teaches courses related to urban America, the American South, and African American history and culture. He is the author of The Atlanta Riot, Race, Class, and Violence in a New South City. Dr. Mixon is currently engaged in research on the Black Southern State Militia, 1865 to 1910, which intersects many of the subtopics he teaches in his classes. Dr. Mixon received his PhD from the University of Cincinnati. And I'll now turn this over to Dr. Rodriquez.
First, I want to thank the Office of the President, ASI, for sponsoring, and all those who were involved in making the arrangements. I'm pleased to be speaking with two really outstanding scholars today. And I want to highlight, I know that Claudia has already introduced them, but Kiran Garcha, History Department's brand new hire, and we are excited to have her and has joined the department from UC Santa Cruz. And also Dr. Gregory Mixon, who I met actually 9 years ago when we were both summer scholars at a 5-week NEH Institute that Claudia mentioned, the African American Freedom Struggles and Civil Rights. It was hosted by Harvard University's Du Bois Institute. And it was a pleasure to learn with him and from him and other scholars. It was a highlight of my career, really a fantastic group of people. I want to open my few words with some well-known words from not an historian, but a novelist, William Faulkner, from his 1950 novel Requiem for a Nun. And a lot of you are probably familiar with this, with these words. This quote from that book. The past is never dead. It's not even past. And it really, I think, speaks to the topic today. While literary scholars might differ on the nuance of the meaning of those words, Faulkner's words really are a reminder that the past has shaped the world in which we live today. And really, decisions that we make today, they're going to shape the world that we live in tomorrow. I know that today each of us is taking a different approach to this topic. It's big, and there are so many ways one could go. But I decided to focus a little bit on talking about the Reconstruction Amendments, in particular the 14th and 15th, which I think are going to provide some context for Kiran and Gregory's remarks. The 13th Amendment, just kind of mentioned, I want to focus on the 14th and 15th, but ratified 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. We could have a whole discussion on that alone. But I want to turn to these the other two amendments. Constitutional scholars will tell you that of all the amendments since the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment is really the most important in terms of the changing role of the federal government with respect to individual rights. It was ratified in 1868, and it did a lot of things. I always tell my students when they leave my class, they better know the 14th Amendment. That's the one thing. If they forget everything else, know the 14th Amendment. It's ratified in 1868, conferred birthright citizenship. In effect, it overturned an earlier court case, the infamous 1857 Dred Scott case, that basically said African Americans could not be citizens of the United States. So it conferred birthright citizens, even though citizenship, but it went beyond African Americans, the 14th Amendment, and Congress was very much aware when they were hammering it out that they were going to extend birthright citizenship to all, basically, not just more narrowly confined to African Americans, to former slaves. It also has, this 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. And it's the first time that equality, the word equality, is mentioned in the Constitution. It says no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, or deprive any citizen of the privileges and immunities of the United States citizenship, or deny any person equal protection of the laws. In essence, it prohibited the states from discriminating against citizens in the law and made the federal government responsible for protecting citizens. This is really a remarkable and I think often underappreciated change and shift, because it makes the federal government responsible for protecting citizens. The first 10 amendments are really curb the power of the federal government, while the 14th empowers the federal government to protect citizens. It shifts some of the power from states to the federal government. And this is really momentous. The great abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts had said that what this did was make the federal government the custodian of freedom. The federal government is responsible for protecting citizens' rights. The other amendment that I want to mention briefly is the 15th that was ratified in 1870. And it, in essence, said that citizens' right to vote could not be abridged or denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In expanding voting rights to African American men who had been denied the right to vote in the wake of the Civil War. The version that Congress passed and later ratified was actually the most conservative of the three that were being discussed. For example, the right to vote is not extended to women. And in fact, when women would get the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, they actually argued, Southern white women anyway, argued that, how is it that Black men are conferred the right to vote when we white women are denied the right to vote? So it's kind of an interesting argument that they made a little bit later. Regardless, each of these amendments were really powerful accomplishments, even though that we can see some shortcomings. I want to point out here that it's very disappointing, but not a surprise, that given the significance of these two amendments that enshrine birthright citizenship, that speak to equal protection under the laws, that confer an expansion of voting rights. It was a surprise to me that there was neither in 2018 nor in 2020 big federal national commemorations of the 150th anniversary of the 14th in 2018 or the 15th in 2020. There's been a lot of attention to the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, expanding the right to vote to women, but the 15th and again the 14th, no. I think one reason is that doing so would have forced the nation to recognize the disconnect between the promise of these amendments and the reality of the country in which we live today. We don't have equality and equal protection. Some people are seen as undeserving of citizenship, and birthright citizenship and voting rights are very much under attack today. I think some people, recognize that if we put a spotlight on these amendments that should be celebrated, it would also spotlight things that some would prefer to remain hidden. There's been a lot of progress over the last 150 years, but a lot of problems, as we all know and recognize, still exist. I want to also point out that these two amendments, as momentous as they were, began to be undermined by Supreme Court cases as early as 1873, just a few years after we see them ratified. And so the promise of these amendments is undermined. The federal government, which was to be the custodian of rights, basically kind of, turned the other way. W.E.B. Du Bois, a great African-American scholar, one of the finest minds of the 20th century, or for that matter, all of American history, wrote that this reactionary shift, this undermining, was this rollback, was, as he said, he put it, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again toward slavery. The political and civil equality that was gained as a result of these amendments and other factors was short-lived, even if social networks and institutions, churches, families, schools, and other organizations gained strength and expanded, really laying the foundations of the structures on which the later civil rights movement would be built upon. The U.S. in this late 19th century enters what historians sometimes refer to as the Nader period of race relations. And what happens during those years sets the legal trajectory on which modern America and race relations developed. The 15th Amendment, a famous court case I'll just mention very briefly, 1898, the Williams versus Mississippi case, in which the Supreme Court ruled that legal obstructions to the vote that Mississippi had put into place in 1890 to disfranchise African Americans did not violate the constitutions. And that basically gave other states the green light to adopt their own disfranchisement laws. It really had a profound impact. Also, a better known case, and we're looking at undermining the 14th Amendment and equal protection, 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson court case that upheld an 1890 segregation law in Louisiana. Basically, it said, in short, that segregation was not unconstitutional. And it gave the green light for the expansion of other segregation laws throughout the American South. Theaters, schools, we all know the story, streetcars, cemeteries, hotels, all these things, segregation laws went into place. They'd existed before, but now it's not unconstitutional. There were people who rejected this and who felt that obviously this is wrong, even Supreme Court justices, but this remains the law of the land. And we see the chipping away, we can say with the modern civil rights movement, even though roots are much earlier to kind of challenge those laws. They didn't go unchallenged, but all kinds of local level court cases. But it's really 1954 to kind of generalize, to kind of make something gigantic and to boil it down to a few years. With the Brown case, that we see this rollback of those reactionary underminings. In 1954, 17 states, including Washington, D.C., were places where public schools were segregated. So the past, those kinds of things that happened in the past, those amendments laying the foundation really did set the tone, the trajectory for modern America. And the legacy of slavery is part of that. This idea, this belief that some people are inferior, this belief, this adherence to white supremacy. The system that replaced slavery, dehumanization, obstacles to opportunity, disequality and a lack of opportunity in housing, political power, social equality, healthcare, it really is shocking. And these kinds of things, we can look that laws can change hearts and minds, but there has to be political will. There has to be a populace that is willing to push these things. We know that things can go backwards, but I want to end on a very, I hope, a positive note, a hopeful note, that I'm astonished in how the last month and a half or so changes that I didn't expect to see coming. Confederate monuments finally coming down, flags, discussion of renaming military bases, some of those things that I didn't expect happening now, they are happening. And so that leaves me hopeful. One way to maybe sum this up is to think in the term of the quote, I don't know what the genesis, but things collapse slowly and then all at once. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I hope that this means a turnaround. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriquez. Next up, we have Dr. Garcha. Dr. Garcha, please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me, and thank you to Jorge and Claudia for organizing the panel. Thank you to my fellow panelists for allowing me to share the space with you today. As Claudia mentioned, my research focuses on the historical role of children in the Black Panther Party, but today, in keeping with the theme of the panel, I'd like to reflect a little bit more broadly on the civil rights movement. So it's a bit more indirectly related to the exact theme than Alicia's talk is, but there are some crossovers. But not just the history. I'd like to spend the brief time I have today also talking about how at this particular moment in time we are remembering and invoking the 1960s. So in this sense, I'm going to be talking about history, but also memory. What are some of the ways, two of the questions that I would like to guide my talk today, if I could get the next slide, please, thank you. One, what are some of the ways this era, the 1960s, is being invoked? And here I'm talking specifically about national discourses and social media. And because of time constraints, I'm going to focus specifically on Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy, but also talk a little bit about the Black Panther Party. And then the second question is, how might we think about the civil rights and Black power movements in the context of today's social and political climate? I do want to note that my comments today are both historically grounded, but they're also guided by my own personal reflections on what I've been seeing on social media and in public conversations over the past couple months. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in framing my talk today, I'm drawing on scholarship that looks at this relationship between history and memory. A lot has been written on this topic, and here I'm citing two authors who have done a lot in this area. Alain Confino, they're both historians. Alain Confino is a cultural historian, and David Thielen. So on this idea of collective memory, right? Confino defines collective memory as, quote, the representation of the past and the making of it into shared cultural knowledge by successive generations in, quote, vehicles of memory, such as books, films, museums, commemorations, and others. He's borrowing the term vehicles of memories here from another scholar. And then David Thielen also reminds us that, quote, memory, private and individual, as much as collective and cultural, is constructed, not reproduced. And he adds, this construction is not made in isolation, but in conversations with others that occur in the context of community, broader politics, and social dynamics. So here I bring up these two specific quotes because I think they do a good job of highlighting that collective memory, and we can think of this in terms of national memory, how we make sense of our past, right, of our national past. Collective memories are constructed by members of a particular group. They form in specific sites or venues, and they change over time, right? And they're also very much shaped by the social and political context in which they are created. So I wanted to talk about this today because I think it's important, particularly as we are in the wake of recent and tragic police killings of Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and unfortunately too many others to properly acknowledge here. But we're also in the midst of an increasingly visible Black Lives Matter movement, and we have once again arrived at an occasion to reflect on the 1960s and 70s. And many of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement are calling for are the same things that activists in the 60s and 70s were demanding as well. So in thinking about this idea of collective memory and the quotes I just shared from David Thielen and Alain Confino, how can we apply these ideas to what we're seeing in the media today? Certainly, social media has become a very important vehicle for memory formation and the transmission of historical narratives. Alicia mentioned the anniversaries of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and things like, statues and other public history markers. And these, I think, I think we are in a very critical moment in kind of revisiting our nation's past, but also our current national identity. So if I could get the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are a ton of images I could have shared today. I just chose one. This excerpt from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I chose this because it's something that I personally have been seeing floating around on Facebook a lot these days. And this is an excerpt from his famous I Have a Dream speech, which he gave in 1963 at the March on Washington. And I think one of the reasons why this is circulating is because it's kind of been in part a response to some of the tactics that we've been seeing by people who have participated in the recent mass marches and protests. And I bring it up because I do think it's very important to remember Dr. King's adoption of nonviolence as both philosophy and movement strategy. Certainly, nonviolence was central to his life's work. He studied Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Independence Movement, and he dedicated his life to nonviolent direct action. But in the context of national conversations about racism in America today, and this moment in which we are grappling with race relations, I think it's also important to think about why certain aspects of Dr. King's legacy tend to gain more traction than others. I'm not on Twitter. I'm talking more about Facebook. So I don't know what's going on Twitter, but also in national conversations. It worries me a little bit that we're seeing less references to the vast work that Dr. King was involved in the 60s and earlier. He was involved in a range of grassroots projects, many of which at the time were considered very radical. He opposed the US involvement in the Vietnam War. He wrote and spoke about the connection between racism in the US and militarism and imperialism abroad. He advocated for workers' rights and government assistance for Americans who were living in poverty. And very much like the activists involved in the Black Lives Matter movement today, he regularly called for an end to police brutality, particularly police violence against Black Americans, because it was at epidemic levels in the 60s. And interestingly, he addresses this topic of police brutality in the very same speech that this excerpt is taken from. So I think it's important to ask why certain aspects of his legacy tend to gain more traction than others. And then relatedly, I kind of packed this talk and I'm not going to have enough time to get through everything, but relatedly to what I just mentioned is the fact that I also think we're seeing less of other concurrent movements that were happening in the 60s too. I studied the Black Panther Party. I don't hear as much about the Black Panther Party in national conversations as I do about Dr. King. And I think oftentimes what does get remembered and reflected on is kind of the spectacular politics, the street politics of the Black Panther Party, the aesthetic of men in leather boots and jackets carrying rifles. And that is central to the iconography of the Black Power movement. But again, the Black Panthers were involved in grassroots projects like Dr. King, and that was really the heart and soul of their work. They created liberation schools for children in the Bay Area and ultimately across the country. And this was in large part because they felt like the public school curriculum was not dealing with it didn't have a focus on Black history and culture. So that's the kind of curriculum that they created for local children. And in fact, their longest running liberation school was so successful and so popular that in 1977, Governor Jerry Brown awarded the school. He granted the faculty and students an award calling the school an exemplary site of learning. And of course, the Panthers also, they had over 20 different community service programs, what they called survival programs. And they also distributed free breakfast to school children. And this was a program that was also emulated by the federal government. So trying to kind of skip over a couple of things, but I guess in closing, I want to ask, so in 2020, in the context of what's happening in our social and political climate right now, how might we think about the 1960s, this part of our nation's history, in a way that highlights this broader context? And so I think if we could go back one slide. Thank you. One way I think that we can do this, and a lot of people have been working on this, is to increase the amount of public markers. And I'm talking about public history here. So I bring up public markers. Alicia mentioned statues. I think markers, statues, and other public markers are important kind of vehicles of memory that Alon Confino is talking about in the quote I shared. And they're important spaces for us to kind of revisit our nation's past, right? And interestingly, the Bay Area does not have that many public markers of the Black Panther Party, even while it was the birthplace of this organization. This is one of the few that exists. This is outside the It's All Good Bakery on Martin Luther King Jr. Way in Oakland, and this is kind of noting where their earliest meetings were. But there really aren't that many others. And people like Robin Spencer, who studies the Black Panther Party, have done a lot of work in trying to get funding to create more kind of public commemorations like this. And so I hope, it is my hope that we keep the push going for this. And then finally, the last slide, please. Thank you. So just returning to my initial questions, and kind of reiterating that memory is a very dynamic process. How we think about the past, as Alicia said, informs how we live and identify ourselves in the present, not just as individuals, but as members of a larger national community. And in thinking about what it means to be American today, how might we make sense of our past in a deliberate and nuanced way? And that is, how might we think about what it meant to be American during the era of the Civil Rights Movement? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garcha. Dr. Mixon, our special guest from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Thank you, Dr. Mixon. Dr. Mixon, I think you're on mute.
I unmuted it. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you from North Carolina. And Alicia, Dr. Rodriquez, thank you for the invitation to be here. My presentation is going to be focused on my evolution as a teacher and evolution in terms of my research. Like Dr. Garcha, history is dynamic. It evolves, it's alive, and it's important. It's important because it helps us in understanding ourselves, in seeing ourselves, and having a vision for defining who we are. History is identity. It's about the present, it's about the past, and it's about the future. History is being written, erased, rewritten, and used, as well as it's political in terms of defining who we think we are and what we are projecting ourselves to be. History is us. The questions we ask of ourselves, others, events, systems, policies, processes, and especially for historians, the sources that we get access to try and tell our stories about the memories of the people that we're working on. And then finally, history is an image of what we as a nation the people, the movements want to convey to the outside world. And so what I would urge all of us to do, particularly as the November 3rd, 2020 election arrives upon us, is to listen very carefully to the political candidates of all stripes in terms of how they define who we are as a nation, who we want to be as a nation. And I think you hear those various visions of what the nation are from each of the candidates. I got into history as a means of helping people find their vision of themselves. And it's been the thing that has driven my instruction since I started in 1978. I teach late 19th and early 20th century African American, Southern, and United States history. And I've written 2 books, and so this is sort of not a shameless plug. But the reason I mentioned the 2 books is because both of the books that I've written address the question of how Black people define themselves, how whites have defined themselves, and this question, does history matter? Because both of the books address how we have dealt with problems, stress, and who we think we are. The Atlanta Riot book, which was about the Atlanta Race Riot of 1906, is about the white response to stress, the stresses of urbanization, the stresses of industrialization, the stresses of consumer capitalism, and the stress of industrial capitalism. All of those things came together in 1906 to create what became the Atlanta Race Riot. I also wrote another book on Black militiamen in Georgia between 1865 and 1905, because I was curious about how did African Americans define freedom, and how did they attempt to operationalize that freedom. And so the militia company, which was sometimes a state-sponsored, meaning the state of Georgia sponsored and paid for that militia unit. And there was also some informal militia units in Georgia that African Americans participated with and in. How did they come out of slavery and define what they viewed freedom to be? For African Americans in Georgia, freedom meant economic autonomy or economic independence, the ability to be able to create a product, sell that product, and profit from that product so that your families would thrive. Another part of that process of defining freedom was having access to political participation in making policy for the state of Georgia. And so Black people did participate politically in Georgia, attempting to define land policy, attempting to define who had access to justice, and how people at the local level will have access to such public places as the courthouse and some other places where you could publicly gather to conduct political business. So history is about how people interact with each other, and that changes over time. It's also a reflection upon what people may have done in 1865 and how that has impacted the 21st century in terms of the questions of power, the question of citizenship, as Dr. Garcha and Dr. Rodriquez have mentioned, the question of belonging. Are you members of this nation? Are you accepted members of this nation? Are you embraced by this nation? And that's the question of belonging. And that was one of the major things that was happening in 1865, and it is still an issue in 2020, evidenced by the fact that George Floyd was murdered evidenced by the fact that LeBron James is told to shut up and bounce his ball, and is evident by Mitch McConnell telling the President of the United States, Barack Obama, to shut up. So the question of belonging, are you an accepted, embraced member of the nation, was at issue in 1865, and it is still an issue in 2020. One of the things that has happened in my teaching is that students, and I've heard recently on the 6 o'clock news, African Americans saying the system was not built for us. What does that mean? Is it that we don't belong? Is that what it means? Does it mean that African Americans are really not citizens of the United States? Does it mean that you don't have access to the ladders of success? All of those things seem to be wrapped up in that one statement: the system was not built for us. I've been wrestling with that for a while. Part of my teaching has been focused on, again, that search for freedom at the end of the Civil War, before disfranchisement happens and the use by whites of violence against Black people. There's one essay by Elsa Barkley Brown called To Catch the Vision of Freedom, reconstructing, I wrote it down, and where is it? Reconstructing Southern Black women's political history, 1865 to 1880. That essay is very important to me in terms of my teaching, because that essay focuses on the fact that African Americans had a vision of what freedom was in 1865. And they went out and tried to operationalize it and make it real. Part of that was being able to figure out where you're going to work and feel good about it, where you're going to be treated fairly as a wage earner, whether or not you could leave and visit family were also important parts of that process. And so when we talk about slavery, when we talk about the United States in the 21st century, we also need to talk about labor. How do people labor? What kind of controls do they have? Do you labor because you want to, or are you forced to labor? Keeping in mind that by the time slavery was abolished in 1865 in the United States, that Blacks were relegated to a reserve labor pool for the nation to be tapped when needed by the nation. That does not seem to have changed either from 1865 to the 21st century. Are African Americans a fundamental part of what it means to labor in the nation? That's a question that not only are African Americans in the United States wrestling with, but they're wrestling with it across the entire Western Hemisphere, all the Americas, because slavery defined all of the Americas. Emancipation was part of the history of all of the Americas. Labor and how Black people were to labor is part of all of the Americas. And so how do Black people have control over when they labor, why they labor, and the products of that labor is at issue? I'm going to share with you, as I come to a close, several scholars. The first one is Ronald W. Walters, who wrote an essay called The Impact of Slavery on 20th and 21st Century Black Progress. That essay argues that in 1865, slavery didn't end. It continued into the 20th century and the 21st century. And evidence of that is in terms of how Black people have access to labor, the results of poverty, the results of the absence of opportunity to be part of the American system, if we can call it that. I also like you to think about Douglas A. Blackman's 2008 book, Slavery by Another Name, Re-enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. And what Blackman does is to look at the United States South, particularly the state of Alabama, in terms of how slavery was fundamental to that particular community, and that after the Civil War and Reconstruction, that whites at the local level found ways to arrest and then imprison and then use Black labor to produce iron and coal. And that constituted slave labor after the Civil War. Blackman argues that slavery ends in 1945 at the end of World War II. I'm not convinced of that because of the following other books that have come out. Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy and Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Both of those books address 21st century America in terms of the justice system, in terms of mass incarceration, the people of color, and the absence of justice and the difficulties created by incarceration in terms of getting access to labor, housing, education, and the benefits of what constitutes the American success story. And then finally, I'd like you to take a look at Khalil Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. Khalil's book looks at the use of crime statistics. And what his major argument is statistics are what you make them to be. They don't speak for themselves. You have to look at them and then decide what the society needs statistics for. And what he also argues is that the European migration to the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was one in which white America looked at crime statistics by Europeans coming to the United States and decided that industrial capitalism was the problem and that Western European immigrants needed to be supported and given access, or at least help them get access to what it meant to be a citizen of the United States. That was not done for African Americans, even though they were living here before the immigrants arrived. And so that hand up, that leg up, that support to understand how to make the system work for you was not provided by the people controlling labor and the economy for African Americans, but it was done for European immigrants. So history matters because it does tell us what the vision of the country is. History matters because it defines how we access power, how we remember things, how we define ourselves, whether that's done at the personal level or at the national level or at the continental level, where all of the Americas has been engaged in this wrestling match over, are Black people citizens of our nation? Do they belong? We've ended slavery, but are they really citizens of the first rank, or are they second, third, or fourth class citizens who we can ignore until we need their labor? Now, end with a quote from Show Thyself a Man, Georgia State Troops Colored, 1865 to 1905. The problems of freedom and emancipation have not been resolved. The promises of freedom, inclusion, and belonging persist in the Western Hemisphere right now. The murder of 9 people at a prayer meeting in Charleston, South Carolina in June 2015 has brought us temporarily together to bring down a flag aimed at opposing civil rights. Yet disfranchising Black citizens is now the aim of various states in the Union. The deaths of young Black people in 2014 and 2015 in Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Ferguson, Missouri, and Charlotte, North Carolina, and the victims of older violence, in North Charleston, South Carolina, New York City, and Hempstead, Texas, have caused many to ask whether Black lives matter. Outside the United States, the Dominican Republic in 2015 has returned to a 20th century policy that negates the citizenship of its Haitian citizens. This is a short list of the problems of freedom in the 21st century. They remind us that Black militiamen and African-descended people over 100 years ago now face similar challenges, including lynching, disfranchisement, and how to establish their worthiness for belonging. What has changed between then and now? The problem of freedom persists. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mixon, for your words. As you mentioned, history is power. It's about history has been erased and rewritten, and it is about power. And I invite our panelists to please, or our attendees to please write questions in the Q&A, and we will answer them right now. First question is for Crystal Rain. In America versus the rest of the world, why are Americans in particular so against taking down Confederate symbols and feel like it's an attack on their history? What in America specifically makes us act in this way?
I'm happy to take a first answer.
Go ahead,
Well, I think one of the things that's important to remember is the Civil War was about slavery. Slavery was the cause. Some people try to deny it and say it's something else. By the time we got to the late 19th century, it was not cool to say, oh yeah, Grandpa fought to keep people enslaved. And so by the time the late 19th century came about, the people who had taken up arms against their country, the people who fought to keep people enslaved, that was not so cool anymore. And so let's make it about something else. It's in the late 19th century, you see the rise of these Confederate statues all over, because the narrative then became, oh, the war wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights and something kind of, nebulous and ambiguous. And everybody was now a hero, right? Everybody was now a hero. So I think it became, African Americans knew the truth. Allies, white allies and others knew the truth. But the idea that this was a war about slavery was pushed aside. And so these statues then, commemorate, hero, Robert E. Lee, this, that, and the other. And I think then that became part of the memory. And I think to kind of speak to things that both Kiran and Gregory said, it's this memory that, that's how this, and that's part of my heritage, not recognizing that, these people fought to keep people enslaved. They took up arms against the United States government, some of them who had been members of the military who would pledge allegiance to the United States, and then they do something else. And so I think with, the proliferation of statues, with this becoming memory that it's not about slavery and everybody's a hero and fought for a noble cause, a so-called lost cause that we could talk about. I think it became hard for some people and certainly don't recognize the origins, what that really means. And I'll stop talking and give with Kiran and Gregory a shot at that too. Maybe add some other things that I'm not coming to mind at this moment.
You want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just add to what Dr. Rodriquez said. I think it has a lot to do with the function of memory itself. As Dr. Rodriquez said, these statues were not erected during or right after the Civil War. They were erected, years later, some, decades later. And I think part of the work that they were doing was trying to create this sense of the past that gave people this idea of, stability and honor. As Dr. Rodriquez mentioned, they were part of this narrative that was being created of this noble cause, right? So I think, I think that's the only thing I would add to that is just, I think this example of the Confederate statues shows very much the powerful work that memory does in creating particular narratives about the past.
The late 19th century is the cause of this. First, the North and the Western parts of the United States have been silent throughout all of this. What happened at the end of the 19th century is that whites came to the conclusion they needed to resolve the Civil War. And to do that meant that whiteness would be the platform upon which the North and the South and the West would come together as fellow Americans. This is also part of the process of declaring that the United States was a white nation only at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The Spanish-American War provided the platform upon which the North, the West, and the South came together as military compadres by fighting Spain in Cuba and in the Philippines, and they then essentially came together as a nation. And so this is also part of this process of declaring that the United States is a nation. Dr. Garcha mentions the fact that Civil War monuments were created long after the Civil War. These are monuments created by the daughters of the Confederacy. Excuse me. Between the 1890s on into the 1930s. And so it's really a part of creating a united nation based on whiteness, but also the problem is the North and the West remain silent in terms of challenging the South and its commemoration and celebration of its rebellion.
Thank you for your responses. Our next question is, can you please explain the difference between slavery in the Americas and pre-modern Islamic slavery?
Pre-modern Islamic slavery?
Yes, I think what she's meaning is there's been discussion of how slavery has existed in our history. There was our African slavery, and there was a sense that there was this other type of slavery prior to African slavery existing. I think that's what she means. Crystal, if you want to clarify your question.
Slavery is a part of the human condition, I think some people would argue. You can find it in the Bible. You can find it in many parts of the world, including Africa. What makes slavery in the Americas important, unique, and different from slavery elsewhere is that it was inherited, for one, it was profitable, for two, and it was the basis of the economies of most of the Americas, for three. What do I mean by inheritance? Slavery would be passed from generation to generation to generation to generation in the Americas, while if you compare it to some studies that were done of slavery in Islam, it's not something that if you are a slave, let's say, for example, I'm a slave now, my daughter and my grandchildren would not automatically be slaves under the supposed Islamic system or even the African system. In the Americas, particularly slavery for plantation production, I'm a slave, my daughter's a slave, my grandchildren are slaves, my great-grandchildren are slaves, my great-great-grandchildren are slaves, my great-great-great-grandchildren will be slaves. That's the difference between the systems, at least in terms of how we've thought about it anyway.
Yeah, this idea of a permanency as well, and race-based as opposed to a fluidity, an opportunity to leave. It's not a permanent state. Yeah.
Also, within the Islamic system, as I understand it, before modern times, there were opportunities for upward mobility. You could be a slave, but you also have responsibilities that allowed you to move into higher positions within a community, depending upon what your responsibilities were. I think the basic example might be is you could be serving in the military in the community, become a general officer or a general in that community, and that would change your status. In the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, chattel slavery, I should have called it chattel slavery, which is how it's defined. There are no opportunities for upward mobility. There are no opportunities for becoming a person who's not defined as a slave. You can't move up in society in the Americas under chattel slavery.
Dr. Garcha, anything to add?
No, I think they summed it up pretty well.
Thank you. And Dr. Mixon, we have a request. You recommended a number of books to read. If you could repeat the list of books that you recommended.
Okay. First one is an article by Ronald W. Walters, and that's in the Journal of African American History, 2012. The title is The Impact of Slavery on 20th and 21st Century Black Progress. That's the impact of slavery on 20th and 21st Century Black Progress. Next is Douglas A. Blackman's Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. That's Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. That was published in 2008. Khalil G. Muhammad, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. That's The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern America, Modern Urban America, excuse me. And that was published originally in 2010 and republished in 2019. Next is Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. There's a new movie out on his life and work. So it's also called Just Mercy. The full title is Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption. Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, published in 2014. And then Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. That was published in 2010 and it's republished in 2020. It's the new Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And those are the books I mentioned. I'm not plugging my own stuff.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question if anybody else has a question. If not, Dr. Mixon, you mentioned that the system was not built for us, specifically for African Americans. What advice would each of you give to our students about challenging that system or creating a system that is built for them?
I think we can look at what Black people did from 1865 to about 1878. That's how they defined freedom. Even though there's a number of things happening that elite whites are trying to implement that are trying to prevent Black people from exercising freedom. I think if we at least look at what Black people did between 1865 and at least 1878, and even beyond that, how they defined themselves, how they worked with themselves. Elsa Barkley Brown's essay, I think, is very important because it tells us how Black women and men, but it's focused on Black women, how Black women worked together. It gives us examples of how Black people defined the circumstances under which they would work. They went to work, they looked for jobs that paid them a fair wage. They looked for jobs that would allow them to maintain family. And they looked for jobs that would not abuse them. Is that not what we fundamentally need in the 21st century? To be seen and respected as human beings who belong to this nation, who are contributing. All of the various television newscasts that report the various deaths of COVID present people who are very, very productive, but we ignore them. We don't see them as worthy, but they're out there helping people every day. And so the challenge to challenge the system is to question its parameters, question its standards in terms of how they define you and how you want to be defined.
Yeah, if I can just add to what Dr. Mixon just said, I think it is very much about questioning the parameters that exist, but I think too it's about doing the work in our communities. I think if we want to exist in a system in which we feel like we belong, we have to build that system. And looking back again to the 1960s and all the movements of the Black freedom struggle that came before the 1960s, these were, mostly community-based movements that were propelled by young people. I mean, the folks in the Black Panther Party were teenagers mostly. And so I think, there is a lot of work to be done. And if we look at the legacy of everything that came out of the 1960s and before and since, a lot has been accomplished, but a lot of it came out of hard work and, everyday struggles. So I think we have to take the onus upon ourselves to get people to see and to hear us.
Yeah, and they were both so eloquent. Really, just the only thing that I want to add is just basically kind of to underscore what they said. Know your rights. Continue the fight. Know what your rights are. That takes you need to educate yourself, because if you don't know what your rights are, if you don't keep up with the news and know what's going on, somebody's going to tell you something, and you might say, "Oh, okay, I didn't know that." So it's incumbent to make sure that you are well educated. I think Gregory mentioned this earlier. The knowing what is going on. I've just lost my thoughts, so my apologies. But continue the fight. Know where your position is in terms of rights. Fight for it. It was really great to see all the people protesting in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And the change that I think was made, the energy that came from that. And I can't imagine that had it not been for COVID, how the size of the crowds would have swelled. There would have been even more people. And that, again, this is a remarkable moment in the history of the United States. And I hope that momentum is harnessed and is going to continue, because we need that. We need this change. And this, I think we're in a period in the history of the United States where the opportunity is there, but it has to come with grassroots pushing, fighting to see that change taking place. No one is going to give anybody anything, rights or anything. People have to fight for it.
I think we're at a crossroads. We're at several crossroads, and we got to figure out which crossroad we're going to take, because there is a community that wants to burn everything down and not share anything. And I'm not talking about Black folks burning the place down. I'm talking about white folks burning the place down. And this new community of people who've been outraged by what happened to George Floyd could have the vision of what the United States is, or says it has always been, in terms of defining what the Declaration of Independence was all about.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists today. Please help me give them a round of applause. We have Dr. Garcha, thank you very much, Dr. Rodriquez, and Dr. Mixon. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your insights and your wisdoms today. Thank you to ASI also for all your recommendations and your hard work on this as well.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.